The lawyer's letter said I had inherited an estate from a great uncle I never knew. A distant branch of the family, he said, a man named Vance. The word estate conjured images of a large house, maybe a bit of land. It did not prepare me for Blackwood Manor. The first sight of it, at the end of a mile-long drive choked with overgrown thorns and skeletal trees, stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't a house, it was a monument to shadow and memory, all jutting spires and grim, leaded windows set into stone the color of a day-old bruise. It looked less like a home and more like a cathedral built to worship some forgotten, sorrowful god. The air, even from inside my car, felt several degrees colder. This was my inheritance, this crushing, beautiful weight of history. The massive oak front door groaned open on hinges that screamed in protest, revealing a cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was a still, museum-quality silence, thick with the smell of dust, beeswax, and the faint, cloying sweetness of linseed oil. And everywhere I looked, there were eyes. Portraits. Hundreds of them. They lined every wall of every room, climbing the grand staircase, watching from the shadows of the library. Men and women in stiff, formal attire from centuries past, their faces pale and severe against backgrounds of dark velvet and stormy skies. Their eyes, all painted with a master's chilling precision, seemed to follow me as I moved through the oppressive silence of my new home. They were not friendly eyes. They were the eyes of judges, of wardens, assessing the new in me. The first night was the worst. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence. It pressed in on my eardrums, a heavy blanket that made every creak of the old settling timber sound like a gunshot. I found myself in the main drawing room, a glass of whiskey in my hand that did nothing to warm the chill in my bones. My gaze kept drifting to the largest portrait above the marble fireplace. A family grouping from what looked like the Victorian era. A stern patriarch with a jaw like granite, a matriarch with lips so thin and cruel they looked like a slash of paint, and their children arrayed around them, their young faces already hardened into masks of haughty indifference. And behind them, almost fading into the gloomy background, were lesser figures. Maids perhaps, or poorer cousins. Their faces were less defined, but their eyes held the same unsettling intensity. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint I thought it was the wind moaning in a chimney flue. But there was no wind. The night was perfectly still. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. The sound came again, a dry rustle like pages turning, but it formed a word. A single sighing word. Welcome, I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty. The only movement was the slow, distorted dance of my reflection in the dark window panes. The word had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I told myself it was fatigue, the stress of the move, the overwhelming strangeness of it all. I drained the whiskey and went to bed, locking the bedroom door behind me, a futile gesture against a fear I couldn't name. Sleep came, but it was not a respite. My dreams were not my own. I was standing in the drawing room, but it was alive with soft candlelight. The air was warm and smelled of perfume and tobacco. And the people from the portraits who were there, moving, breathing, their stiff clothing rustling as they mingled. The patriarch, Vance himself according to the plaque, stood by the fire holding a glass of brandy. He turned his head, and those pitiless eyes locked onto mine. He didn't speak with his mouth. The words just appeared in my mind, clear and cold as ice. It is a relief to finally have you home, Elias. The line must be sustained. The legacy must be preserved. I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but my dream self had no voice. I could only watch, a prisoner in my own mind. The matriarch glided over, her gown whispering across the Persian rug. She reached out a cold, dry hand and touched my cheek. Her touch felt like parchment. You have his eyes, her voice hissed in my thoughts, the weakness in his eyes. We will remedy that. I woke up gasping, drenched in a cold sweat. The room was pitch black, the silence absolute. But the feeling of that woman's touch lingered on my skin like a stain. It was just a dream. A hyper-vivid, terrifying dream, but a dream nonetheless. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering dread. I decided to explore the house, to claim it, to prove to myself that it was just brick and mortar and old paint. I ended up back in the drawing room, my eyes irresistibly drawn to the large family portrait. I needed to see them as just paint and canvas again. I studied the severe faces, the meticulously rendered lace, the glint of light on a painted jewel. My gaze drifted over the background figures, the silent, nameless observers. And that's when my blood ran cold. There was a young man standing slightly behind the youngest Vance daughter. In my memory, he was a blur of brown hair and a neutral expression, just another anonymous face in the crowd of paint. But that wasn't what I was seeing now. His face had been altered. The features were sharper, more defined. The hair was now my shade of dirty blonde, not brown. The set of the jaw, the slight crookedness of the nose from a long ago break. It was all mine. But the most horrifying part was the eyes. They were no longer the vague, painted eyes of a background extra. They were my eyes, wide with a dawning, silent horror, staring out from the canvas, trapped in a scream that hadn't yet found a voice. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth. This wasn't possible. It was a trick of the light, a product of my sleep-deprived brain. I rushed forward, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the canvas. It was dry, ancient and dry. The paint was cracked and yellowed with age around my face. It looked as if it had been there for 100 years. That was the second event, the point of no return. The dreams that night were a torrent. I wasn't an observer anymore, I was a participant. I stood amongst them in that candlelit room, and they spoke to me directly, their silent voices overlapping in my skull. The paint is memory, Alistair's voice boomed. Memory is life. We preserve ourselves here, in the permanence of art. You are the last of the blood, the matriarch crooned, her mental voice like scraping metal. The anchor. Your vitality will sustain us for another century. It is your purpose. No, I tried to scream in the dream, and this time a sound came out, a muffled, choked gasp. Let me go! The patriarch smiled, a terrifying cracking of his stern features. There is no going back. The process has begun. You are becoming part of the collection. I woke up not in my bed, but on the cold, hard floor of the drawing room. I was still in my pajamas. My right hand was stained a faint, rusty red. I scrambled to my feet, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I hadn't sleepwalked since I was a child. And on the floor beside me, sitting innocently on the rug, was an old, dried-out artist's palette knife, caked with flecks of ancient paint. I looked up at the portrait. The figure that looked like me was clearer, more detailed. The expression of horror was more pronounced. And the colors were brighter, fresher, compared to the faded tones of the family around it. It was as if someone had been working on it while I slept. That was the third event, the confirmation. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was a living, breathing prison. The family wasn't preserving their history in these portraits. They were parasites trapping their heirs, using our lives, our very essence, to repaint their own existence, to sustain their awful immortality on canvas. I wasn't the heir. I was the sacrifice. Panic, pure and undiluted, flooded my system. I had to get out. Now. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't stop for anything. I ran from the drawing room, my socks slipping on the polished wood floors, and sprinted for the grand front door. I grabbed the massive iron handle, yanked it with all my strength, and threw the door open. It didn't open onto the overgrown drive in my waiting car. It opened onto the portrait gallery, the long, dark hallway lined with hundreds of watching eyes. The same hallway that was on the other side of the house. I slammed the door shut, a sob catching in my throat. It was impossible. I whirled around and ran for the kitchen, for the servants' entrance. I burst through the door, and instead of a small porch and steps leading down to the garden, I was staring into the library, at the wall of portraits of grim-faced scholars. No. I ran from window to window, but every pane of glass looked out onto a different interior room of the house, always a room filled with portraits. The windows had become paintings themselves, frames for the nightmare within. The house had folded in on itself. There were no more exits. The mansion was no longer a building. It was a finished canvas, and I was trapped inside the frame. A deep, resonant sound began to echo through the halls, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. It was the slow, steady ticking of a giant clock, a sound I had never heard in the house before. But with each tick, the light in the room began to change. It grew softer, warmer, more golden. The electric lights dimmed and died, replaced by the flickering glow of candlelight that bloomed from sconces on the walls. The smell of dust was replaced by the scent of perfume and tobacco. I backed into the center of the main hall, turning in a slow, terrified circle. The figures in the portraits were no longer still. Their chests rose and fell with slow, simulated breath. Their eyes tracked my every move with a hungry, possessive glee. The patriarch, Alistair Vance, gave me the faintest nod of acknowledgement from his frame above the fireplace. A profound weakness washed over me, a sudden and heavy exhaustion. My limbs felt like lead. I tried to fight it to stay on my feet, but my legs buckled. I collapsed to my knees on the cold stone floor. I couldn't move. I could only watch. From the shadows of the gallery, a figure emerged. It was not quite solid, a shimmering apparition of a man in a paint-stained smock, holding a brush and a palette. The family's eternal artist. He glided towards a large family portrait. He didn't look at me. He looked at the canvas. He raised his brush, dipped it into nothingness on his palette, and began to paint the air in front of the portrait. And with every stroke he made in the empty space, a corresponding stroke appeared on the canvas. He was finishing his work. He was painting me in. A searing cold pain shot through my body, not on my skin, but deep inside in my very core. It felt like my soul was being stretched, pulled across the room towards that canvas. My vision began to dim at the edges, the world shrinking to a tunnel focused on that painting. The sounds of the ticking clock and the rustling of spectral gowns faded, replaced by a high-pitched ringing. The last thing I saw with perfect crystalline clarity was my own face on the portrait. It was no longer frozen in a silent scream. It was complete, perfect. My eyes held the same severe, haughty, and timeless judgment as all the others. My back was straight, my clothes were of a bygone era. I was one of them. The pain ceased. The weakness vanished. I felt nothing. No fear. No panic. Just a cold, serene permanence. My perspective had shifted. I was no longer on the floor. I was looking out from the canvas. I could see the grand hall, see the faint, shimmering forms of my new family moving in the candlelight. I could see my own body, kneeling on the floor below, head bowed, as still and lifeless as a discarded doll. And then slowly it began to flake away, crumbling into dust until nothing remained but a small, sad pile of ashes on the stone. The dust settled. The candlelight flickered. The ticking clock faded away, leaving once more the perfect museum silence. I am here now. I am part of the collection. I am preserved. I watch, and I wait. We all wait, here in the silence of the paint, for the next heir to foolishly walk through the door. The line must be sustained. The legacy must be preserved. Was it real, or was it all a terrible dream from which I can't wake up? I guess we'll never know. Unless you join me next time for the story of the lullaby that plays from a music box found buried in a garden. A lullaby that only the sleeping can hear.